The busy downtown cafe was filled with the usual lunch crowd when something happened that would change multiple lives forever. A hard-working waitress was serving customers when she noticed a young man harassing a black woman who was sitting alone at her table. The waitress didn't hesitate to step in and defend the woman, even though the young man was clearly wealthy and used to getting his way. She threw him out of the cafe despite his protests and threats. What the waitress didn't know was that this spoiled young man was the son of one of the most powerful billionaires in the city. And when his father arrived at the cafe to see what had happened, his reaction would surprise everyone. The waitress thought she was just protecting a customer and doing what was right, but she was about to discover that this single act of courage would change her life in ways she never could have imagined. If you're someone who appreciates emotional stories, we'd love for you to like and subscribe. There's more to come that might move you too. Sophie Martinez had been working at Metro Cafe for 3 years, and she thought she had seen everything. The busy downtown restaurant attracted all kinds of customers: business people grabbing quick lunches, students studying over coffee, tourists exploring the city, and everything in between. At 26 years old, Sophie was one of the most experienced waitresses at the cafe. She knew how to handle difficult customers, manage multiple tables during the lunch rush, and keep a smile on her face even when dealing with rude or demanding people. The job didn't pay much, but Sophie was saving every penny she could to eventually go back to school and finish her college degree. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon when everything changed. The cafe was packed with the usual crowd of office workers taking their lunch breaks. Sophie was balancing 4 plates on her arms while weaving between tables when she noticed a commotion near the window section. A young man who looked to be in his early 20s was sitting at a table next to a black woman in her 30s. The woman was alone, quietly eating her salad and reading a book, clearly trying to enjoy a peaceful lunch. But the young man kept leaning over toward her table, making comments and trying to get her attention. Sophie could see that the woman was uncomfortable. She was avoiding eye contact with the young man and had moved her chair as far away from his table as possible. But the young man didn't seem to care about her obvious discomfort. "Come on, beautiful," Sophie heard him say as she passed nearby. "I just want to talk. Don't be so stuck up." The woman ignored him and continued reading her book, but Sophie could see that her hands were shaking slightly as she turned the pages. Sophie had dealt with situations like this before. Some customers, especially young men who had been drinking or thought their money made them important, sometimes bothered other customers. Usually, a polite word from staff was enough to stop the behavior, but something about this situation felt different. The young man was well dressed in expensive clothes and was wearing a watch that probably cost more than Sophie made in 6 months. He had the kind of confidence that came from never being told no in his life. When he spoke to the woman, his tone was demanding rather than respectful, like he expected her to pay attention to him whether she wanted to or not. "Excuse me," Sophie said, approaching the young man's table. "Sir, I need to ask you to keep your voice down and respect the other customer's privacy." The young man looked up at Sophie with annoyance. "I'm just being friendly. What's wrong with that?" "The lady is clearly trying to enjoy her lunch in peace," Sophie said firmly but politely. "I'm sure you can understand that." The young man glanced at the woman, then back at Sophie with a smirk. "Maybe she's just playing hard to get. Some women like that." Sophie felt her anger rising, but she kept her voice professional. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the other customers alone. If you want to have a conversation with someone, I'd suggest calling a friend." "Look, waitress," the young man said, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "I'm paying for my meal just like everyone else. I can talk to whoever I want." Other customers were starting to notice the confrontation. Sophie could see people at nearby tables turning to look, and she knew she needed to handle this situation quickly before it escalated further. "Actually, sir, you can't," Sophie said, maintaining her calm tone despite her growing anger. "This is a private business, and we have the right to ask customers to behave respectfully toward other patrons." The young man stood up from his table, and Sophie realized he was taller than she had thought. He was about 6 feet tall, and had the kind of muscular build that suggested he worked out regularly. For a moment, Sophie felt intimidated, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "Do you know who I am?" the young man asked, stepping closer to Sophie. "I don't care who you are," Sophie replied honestly. "I care about making sure all our customers feel safe and comfortable." The young man's face flushed with anger. "My father owns half this city. I could have you fired with one phone call." Sophie felt a moment of fear. Jobs were hard to find and she couldn't afford to be unemployed. But then she looked over at the black woman, who was watching the confrontation with worry and gratitude in her eyes. Sophie realized that some things were more important than job security. "Then make your phone call," Sophie said, crossing her arms. "But until someone tells me otherwise, I'm asking you to stop bothering this woman and behave like a decent human being." The young man stared at Sophie in shock. He was clearly not used to being challenged, especially not by someone he considered beneath his social class. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth, "but this isn't over." The young man threw a $20 bill on his table and stormed toward the exit, but not before stopping next to the black woman's table one more time. "You're missing out," he said to her loudly, making sure other customers could hear. "I don't usually waste my time on people like you anyway." The racist undertone of his comment made Sophie's blood boil. She followed him toward the door, her professionalism finally giving way to genuine anger. "Actually," Sophie said loudly enough for the entire cafe to hear, "I think you need to leave right now and don't come back." The young man spun around to face Sophie. "You can't kick me out. I'm a paying customer." "I absolutely can kick you out," Sophie said, her voice strong and clear. "This establishment reserves the right to refuse service to anyone who harasses other customers or makes racist comments. You've done both, so you're no longer welcome here." The entire cafe had gone quiet. Everyone was watching the confrontation between the young waitress and the wealthy customer. Sophie could feel all eyes on her, but she didn't back down. "You have no idea what you've just done," the young man said menacingly. "My father is going to destroy this place and everyone who works here." "Your father didn't harass a customer," Sophie said calmly. "You did, and you're the one who needs to leave." The young man looked around the cafe and seemed to realize that everyone was staring at him with disapproval. Even the other wealthy-looking customers were shaking their heads at his behavior. "This isn't over," he repeated, then stormed out of the cafe, slamming the door behind him. The cafe slowly returned to normal conversation levels, but Sophie could feel that the atmosphere had changed. Some customers were looking at her with admiration, while others seemed nervous about what might happen next. Sophie walked over to the black woman's table to check on her. "I'm so sorry about that," Sophie said. "Are you okay?" The woman looked up at Sophie with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank you for standing up for me. Most people would have just looked the other way." "No one should have to deal with that kind of behavior," Sophie said. "I hope the rest of your lunch is peaceful." "What's your name?" the woman asked. "Sophie Martinez," Sophie replied. "I'm Dr. Angela Davis," the woman said, extending her hand to shake Sophie's. "I work at the medical center downtown. If you ever need anything, please don't hesitate to call me." "Doctor." Davis handed Sophie her business card, which showed that she was a cardiologist at one of the city's most prestigious hospitals. As Sophie returned to her other tables, she felt good about what she had done, but she also felt worried about the young man's threats. If his father really was as powerful as he claimed, Sophie might have just made a very dangerous enemy. What Sophie didn't know was that the young man's father, billionaire businessman Harrison Blake, was already on his way to the cafe. He had received an angry phone call from his son demanding that he do something about the waitress who had humiliated him. But Harrison Blake's reaction to the situation would be very different from what his son expected. The billionaire had built his fortune by recognizing talent and character when he saw it, and he was about to see both qualities in a young waitress who had chosen to do the right thing, regardless of the consequences. Sophie thought her day was over, but it was actually just beginning. 30 minutes after the confrontation, Sophie was refilling coffee for a table of business people when she noticed a commotion near the entrance. The cafe manager, Mr. Rodriguez, was standing by the door talking to a tall, distinguished man in an expensive dark suit. Even from across the room, Sophie could tell this wasn't an ordinary customer. The man was probably in his late 40s, with graying hair at his temples and the kind of presence that commanded attention. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who was used to being the most important person in any room. Several customers had stopped their conversations to look at him, and Sophie heard someone whisper, "Is that Harrison Blake?" Sophie's heart sank. Harrison Blake was one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the city. His real estate and technology companies employed thousands of people, and his name was on several buildings downtown. If this was the father of the young man she had thrown out, Sophie was probably about to lose her job. Mr. Rodriguez was gesturing toward Sophie's section of the cafe while talking to Harrison Blake. The billionaire listened carefully, nodding occasionally, but his expression was unreadable. Sophie tried to continue working normally, but she could feel her hands shaking as she poured coffee. "Sophie," Mr. Rodriguez called out, "could you come here for a moment?" Sophie took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance, trying to prepare herself for whatever was about to happen. She had known when she confronted the young man that there might be consequences, but she had done what she thought was right. "Sophie Martinez, this is Mr. Harrison Blake," Mr. Rodriguez said nervously. "He'd like to speak with you about what happened earlier." Harrison Blake extended his hand to shake Sophie's, and she was surprised by how firm but respectful his handshake was. "Ms. Martinez," Harrison Blake said, "I understand you had an encounter with my son Jeremy about an hour ago." Sophie looked Harrison Blake directly in the eyes, refusing to be intimidated, despite the obvious power difference between them. "Yes, sir," I did, Sophie said. Your son was harassing another customer, and I asked him to stop. When he refused and made racist comments, I asked him to leave. Harrison Blake studied Sophie's face as she spoke, paying attention not just to her words, but to her tone and body language. Can you tell me exactly what happened? Harrison Blake asked. I'd like to hear your version of events. Sophie glanced at Mr. Rodriguez, who nodded encouragingly, though she could see the worry in his eyes. Your son was bothering a woman who was eating lunch alone, Sophie explained. She was clearly uncomfortable and trying to ignore him, but he kept making inappropriate comments and wouldn't leave her alone. What kind of comments? Harrison Blake asked. Sophie hesitated, not wanting to make the situation worse, but deciding that honesty was the best approach. He called her beautiful and told her not to be stuck up when she ignored him, Sophie said. When I asked him to respect her privacy, he said maybe she was playing hard to get, and that he could talk to whoever he wanted because he was paying for his meal. Harrison Blake's jaw tightened slightly, but he motioned for Sophie to continue. When I told him this was a private business and we had the right to ask customers to behave respectfully, he threatened to have me fired, Sophie continued. He said his father owned half the city and could get me fired with one phone call. And what did you say to that? Harrison Blake asked. Sophie felt a moment of fear, realizing she was about to tell a billionaire that she had essentially dismissed his threats. I told him to make his phone call, but that I was still going to ask him to stop bothering the woman, Sophie said. When he left, he made a racist comment to her, saying he didn't usually waste time on people like her. That's when I told him he needed to leave and not come back. Harrison Blake was quiet for several long moments, processing what Sophie had told him. Mr. Rodriguez looked increasingly nervous, probably worried about losing an important customer or facing legal problems. Miss Martinez, Harrison Blake finally said, can you tell me about the woman my son was bothering? Her name is Dr. Angela Davis, Sophie said. She's a cardiologist at the medical center downtown. She was just trying to eat lunch and read her book in peace. And how did she react to your intervention? Harrison Blake asked. She thanked me, Sophie said simply. She said most people would have looked the other way. Harrison Blake nodded slowly, then turned to Mr. Rodriguez. Could you give Ms. Martinez and me a few minutes to talk privately? Harrison Blake asked. Mr. Rodriguez nodded quickly and walked away, clearly relieved to be out of the conversation. Harrison Blake gestured toward an empty table in the corner of the cafe. Would you mind sitting down with me for a moment? Sophie followed him to the table, her mind racing with possibilities about what he might say. She expected him to be angry about her treatment of his son, or to threaten her job, or to demand an apology. Ms. Martinez, Harrison Blake said once they were seated, I owe you an apology. Sophie stared at him in shock. Sir? My son's behavior was completely unacceptable, Harrison Blake said firmly. Harassing a woman who was minding her own business, making racist comments, threatening a service worker. None of that is how I raised him, and none of it reflects the values I try to instill in my employees. Sophie felt like she was in some kind of alternate reality. She had expected anger and threats, not an apology. You don't need to apologize for your son's actions, Sophie said carefully. Actually, I do, Harrison Blake replied. Jeremy is 23 years old, and he's my responsibility until he learns to behave like an adult. What he did today was shameful, and the way you handled it was admirable. Sophie didn't know how to respond to that. Can I ask you something, Ms. Martinez? Harrison Blake continued. When Jeremy threatened to have you fired, were you afraid? Yes, Sophie said honestly. I need this job, but I was more concerned about Dr. Davis feeling safe and comfortable. Even though standing up for her might have cost you your livelihood, Harrison Blake asked. Some things are more important than job security, Sophie said. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their race or gender or social status. Harrison Blake leaned back in his chair, studying Sophie with what looked like admiration. How long have you been working here? Harrison Blake asked. 3 years, Sophie replied. What did you do before this? I was in college studying business administration, but I had to drop out when my father got sick and needed expensive medical treatment, Sophie explained. I've been working here to help support my family and save money to go back to school someday. Harrison Blake was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Ms. Martinez, I have a proposition for you, Harrison Blake said. I'm always looking for people with strong character and leadership potential to join my companies. Would you be interested in hearing about an opportunity that might change your life? Sophie felt her heart racing. What kind of opportunity? I need an assistant manager for one of my downtown office buildings, Harrison Blake said. The position requires someone who can handle difficult people diplomatically but firmly, who can make tough decisions under pressure, and who has the integrity to do the right thing, even when it's difficult. Sophie stared at Harrison Blake, trying to process what he was saying. Based on what I've observed today, you have all of those qualities, Harrison Blake continued. The position pays $60,000 a year, plus benefits and opportunities for advancement. I would also be willing to pay for you to finish your college degree part-time. Sophie felt like she might faint. $60,000 was more than twice what she made at the cafe, and the opportunity to finish school would change her entire future. Why? Sophie asked. Why would you offer me this opportunity? Because you stood up for what was right when it would have been easier to look the other way, Harrison Blake said. Because you treated a stranger with respect and dignity, even when it might have cost you your job. Those are the kinds of people I want working for me. Sophie felt tears forming in her eyes. After years of struggling to make ends meet and wondering if she would ever be able to build a better life for herself and her family, someone was offering her a real opportunity. I don't know what to say, Sophie said. Say you'll think about it, Harrison Blake replied. Take tonight to consider the offer. If you're interested, come to my office tomorrow morning and we can discuss the details. Harrison Blake stood up and handed Sophie an elegant business card with his contact information. Ms. Martinez, he said, thank you for showing my son what real character looks like. Even if he didn't appreciate the lesson at the time, I hope he learned something from your example. As Harrison Blake left the cafe, Sophie sat at the empty table staring at his business card and trying to process what had just happened. She had started the day as a waitress making minimum wage, and now she was being offered a corporate position that could transform her life. What Sophie didn't know was that Harrison Blake's son, Jeremy, was furious about his father's reaction to the situation. Jeremy had expected his father to punish the waitress who had humiliated him, not offer her a job. The young man was already planning ways to make Sophie's life difficult if she accepted the position. The opportunity Harrison Blake was offering would indeed change Sophie's life, but it would also put her directly in the path of a spoiled young man who was used to getting revenge on anyone who stood up to him. Sophie spent the entire night awake, staring at Harrison Blake's business card and trying to decide whether to accept his job offer. Part of her was thrilled by the opportunity. The salary alone would allow her to help her family and save for her future in ways she had never imagined possible. But another part of her was terrified about working in a corporate environment where she would be completely out of her element. At 7 in the morning, Sophie called the number on the business card. Harrison Blake's assistant scheduled her for a meeting at 9 o'clock, giving Sophie just enough time to shower, put on her only professional outfit, and take the subway downtown to Blake Enterprises headquarters. The Blake building was a gleaming 40-story skyscraper in the heart of the financial district. Sophie felt intimidated just walking through the marble lobby, which was filled with expensive artwork and populated by people in designer suits who looked like they belonged in a different world from her. Harrison Blake's office was on the 38th floor and had floor-to-ceiling windows that offered stunning views of the city. When Sophie was escorted into the office by his assistant, Harrison Blake stood up from behind a massive mahogany desk and greeted her with the same respectful handshake he had given her at the cafe. Ms. Martinez, thank you for coming, Harrison Blake said. Please have a seat. Sophie sat down in one of the leather chairs facing his desk, trying not to feel overwhelmed by the luxury and power that surrounded her. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, Harrison Blake said, and I'm even more convinced that you would be an excellent addition to my team. Mr. Blake, Sophie said, I have to be honest with you. I don't have any experience in corporate management. I'm not sure I'm qualified for the position you're offering. Harrison Blake smiled. Experience can be taught, Ms. Martinez. Character cannot. You demonstrated yesterday that you have the integrity and courage that I value most in my employees. What would my responsibilities be? Sophie asked. You would be assistant manager of our downtown office complex, which houses several of my companies, Harrison Blake explained. You would oversee building operations, manage tenant relations, coordinate with maintenance and security staff, and handle any problems that arise. Sophie tried to imagine herself in such a role, but it seemed almost impossible. The position also comes with something else, Harrison Blake continued. My son Jeremy works in our business development department. He'll be working in the same building, and you'll occasionally interact with him in a professional capacity. Sophie felt her stomach drop. The thought of having to work with the young man who had harassed Dr. Davis and threatened her was terrifying. Mr. Blake, Sophie said carefully, your son made it clear that he doesn't like me. Won't that create problems in the workplace? Harrison Blake's expression became serious. Jeremy needs to learn that actions have consequences and that treating people badly will not be tolerated in my companies. Working with you will be a good lesson for him in professionalism and respect. What if he tries to make my job difficult? Sophie asked. Then he'll find himself looking for employment elsewhere, Harrison Blake said firmly. I don't tolerate harassment or unprofessional behavior from anyone, including family members. Sophie felt somewhat reassured by Harrison Blake's strong stance, but she was still nervous about the potential for conflict. "Ms. Martinez," Harrison Blake said, "I understand your concerns, but I believe you're exactly the kind of person who can handle challenging situations with grace and professionalism. That's why I want you on my team." Sophie thought about her current life, working long hours at the cafe for minimal pay, worrying about her family's finances, wondering if she would ever be able to finish her education. This opportunity could change everything. "I accept," Sophie said. "When would you like me to start?" "Monday morning," Harrison Blake replied. "That gives you the rest of the week to give notice at the cafe and prepare for your new role." They spent the next hour discussing salary, benefits, and job responsibilities. Sophie would earn $60,000 a year, plus health insurance for herself and her family, and the company would pay for her to take evening classes toward finishing her business degree. As Sophie left Harrison Blake's office, she felt like she was walking on air. In the span of 24 hours, her life had completely changed direction. She went straight to the cafe to give Mr. Rodriguez her notice and share the incredible news with her co-workers. The following Monday morning, Sophie arrived at Blake Enterprises wearing a new professional outfit she had bought over the weekend. She felt nervous but excited as she was shown to her office on the 15th floor. Sophie's office was small but beautiful, with a window overlooking the city and modern furniture that was nicer than anything she had ever owned. Her assistant, Maria, was a friendly woman in her 40s who had worked for the company for 8 years and was eager to help Sophie learn her new responsibilities. "Mr. Blake told me to take good care of you," Maria said with a smile. "He's really excited about having you join the team." Sophie spent her first morning learning about the building's operations, meeting department heads, and familiarizing herself with company policies. Everyone she met was welcoming and professional, and Sophie began to feel like she might actually be able to succeed in this new environment. Then, at 11 o'clock, Jeremy Blake walked into her office. Jeremy looked exactly the same as he had at the cafe, but now he was wearing an expensive suit and had the confidence that came from being on his home turf. His expression when he saw Sophie was a mixture of anger and disbelief. "So it's true," Jeremy said, closing Sophie's office door behind him. "My father actually hired the waitress who humiliated me." Sophie stood up from her desk, trying to maintain her professionalism despite the uncomfortable situation. "Good morning, Jeremy," Sophie said calmly. "I'm looking forward to working with you." Jeremy laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Working with me? You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." "I'm here to do my job," Sophie said firmly. "I hope we can maintain a professional relationship." "Professional?" Jeremy said, stepping closer to Sophie's desk. "You threw me out of a cafe like I was some kind of criminal. Now you think we're going to be colleagues?" Sophie felt her anger rising, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Jeremy, what happened at the cafe was about your behavior toward another customer. This is a workplace, and I expect both of us to act professionally here." Jeremy stared at Sophie for a long moment, clearly trying to intimidate her. But Sophie had dealt with difficult customers for years, and she wasn't going to be bullied now. "Let me make something clear," Jeremy said in a low voice. "I don't care what my father thinks of you. I don't care what job title you have. You're still just a waitress who got lucky, and I'm going to make sure everyone in this building knows it." "Are you threatening me?" Sophie asked directly. Jeremy smiled coldly. "I'm just explaining how things work around here. My family owns this company. You're a charity case who won't last 6 months." Sophie felt hurt by Jeremy's words, but she also felt determination rising inside her. She had worked too hard and come too far to let a spoiled young man sabotage her opportunity. "Jeremy," Sophie said, meeting his gaze directly, "I'm sorry you're upset about what happened at the cafe, but I'm here now and I'm going to do my job well regardless of how you feel about it." Jeremy looked surprised by Sophie's calm response. He had clearly expected her to be intimidated or to back down. "We'll see about that," Jeremy said, then turned and left Sophie's office without another word. After Jeremy left, Sophie sat down at her desk and took a deep breath. She realized that her new job was going to be more challenging than she had expected, not because of the work itself, but because of the personal conflict with her boss's son. But Sophie had not come this far to give up easily. She was determined to prove that Harrison Blake's faith in her was justified, and that she belonged in this new world she was trying to build for herself. What Sophie didn't know was that Jeremy's hostility toward her was about more than just wounded pride. He was genuinely threatened by her presence in the company, because Sophie represented everything that Jeremy was not: hardworking, principled, and genuinely concerned about other people. Over the next few weeks, Jeremy would try various ways to undermine Sophie's work and damage her reputation with other employees. But his efforts would ultimately backfire, because Sophie's natural talent for leadership and her commitment to treating everyone with respect would win her allies throughout the company. And eventually, Jeremy's attempts to sabotage Sophie would force him to spend more time around her, which would lead to an unexpected discovery that the waitress he was trying to destroy was actually a remarkable woman who challenged him to become a better person. 3 months into her new job, Sophie had not only survived Jeremy's attempts to sabotage her work, but had actually thrived in her role as assistant manager. She had implemented new systems that improved building efficiency, resolved several tenant complaints that had been ongoing for months, and earned the respect of employees throughout the company. Jeremy, meanwhile, had grown increasingly frustrated with his inability to undermine Sophie's success. Every scheme he devised seemed to backfire, making Sophie look more competent and making him look petty and unprofessional. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon when a water pipe burst on the 20th floor, flooding 3 offices and threatening to damage expensive computer equipment. Sophie was in a meeting when the emergency occurred, but she immediately took charge of the situation. While other employees panicked, Sophie coordinated with the maintenance staff to shut off the water, arranged for emergency cleanup crews, helped evacuate the affected offices, and set up temporary workspaces for the displaced employees. She worked for 6 straight hours, getting soaked and dirty in the process but ensuring that business operations continued with minimal disruption. Jeremy happened to be in the building when the emergency occurred, and he found himself watching Sophie handle the crisis with calm efficiency and genuine concern for everyone affected. For the first time, he saw her not as the waitress who had humiliated him, but as a capable professional who was willing to get her hands dirty to solve problems. "Sophie," Jeremy said, approaching her as she finished coordinating with the cleanup crew, "that was impressive." Sophie looked up at Jeremy with surprise. It was the first time he had spoken to her without hostility since she had started working at the company. "Thank you," Sophie said, wiping her wet hands on a towel. "It was just part of the job." "Most people in your position would have delegated the dirty work to someone else," Jeremy observed. "You didn't have to crawl around on the floor helping to move equipment." Sophie shrugged. "Everyone was working hard to fix the problem. I wasn't going to stand around watching while other people did the heavy lifting." Jeremy studied Sophie's face and realized that she genuinely didn't understand why her hands-on approach was unusual. She hadn't been trying to impress anyone. She had simply done what needed to be done. "Can I buy you a coffee?" Jeremy asked impulsively. "You look like you could use a break." Sophie hesitated, unsure whether Jeremy was being sincere or setting up some new way to embarrass her. "I'm not going to poison you," Jeremy said with what might have been his first genuine smile since Sophie had met him. "I just thought maybe we could talk." Sophie was exhausted and curious about what Jeremy wanted to discuss, so she agreed to go to the coffee shop in the building's lobby. As they sat across from each other with their drinks, Jeremy seemed nervous, like he wasn't sure how to begin the conversation he wanted to have. "Sophie," Jeremy said finally, "I owe you an apology." Sophie nearly dropped her coffee cup. "What? I've been acting like a spoiled child for the past 3 months, Jeremy said, looking down at his hands. "I was embarrassed about what happened at the cafe, and I took it out on you instead of dealing with my own behavior." Sophie didn't know how to respond. She had expected many things from Jeremy, but a sincere apology was not one of them. "I was wrong about you," Jeremy continued. "You're not just some waitress who got lucky. You're smart and capable and hardworking, and you genuinely care about doing a good job." "Thank you," Sophie said quietly. "That means a lot coming from you." Jeremy looked up and met Sophie's eyes. "Can we start over? I mean, can we try to work together professionally instead of me acting like a jerk all the time?" Sophie considered Jeremy's request. She had been prepared to continue dealing with his hostility indefinitely, but the possibility of actually working with him instead of against him was appealing. "I'd like that," Sophie said, "but I need you to understand something." "What?" Jeremy asked. "I'm not going anywhere," Sophie said firmly. "I've worked too hard to get here, and I'm not going to let anyone drive me away. If we're going to work together, it has to be as equals, not as you doing me a favor." Jeremy nodded. "Fair enough. I respect that." Over the next few weeks, Jeremy made a genuine effort to change his attitude towards Sophie. He started greeting her politely when they passed in the hallways, included her in relevant business discussions, and even asked for her opinion on a project he was working on. Sophie was cautiously optimistic about the change in their relationship, but she remained professional and didn't let her guard down completely. She had learned not to trust Jeremy's moods too quickly. The real change in their dynamic came when Sophie had to work late one evening to prepare for a tenant meeting the next morning. Most of the building was empty, and Sophie was alone in her office reviewing contracts when Jeremy knocked on her door. "You're here late," Jeremy observed, leaning against the doorframe. "Big presentation tomorrow," Sophie explained. I want to make sure I have all the details right. Jeremy looked at the papers scattered across Sophie's desk and the empty coffee cups that indicated she had been working for hours. Want some help? Jeremy asked. I'm pretty good with financial projections and contract analysis. Sophie looked at Jeremy suspiciously. Why would you want to help me? Because it's almost midnight, you look exhausted, and we're supposed to be working as a team now, Jeremy said. Plus, I know these tenants personally, so I might have insights that could be useful. Sophie was touched by the offer, and she was tired enough to accept help even from Jeremy. Okay, Sophie said. Thank you. Jeremy pulled up a chair next to Sophie's desk, and they spent the next 2 hours going through the presentation materials together. Jeremy turned out to be genuinely knowledgeable about the business aspects of building management, and his suggestions improved Sophie's presentation significantly. As they worked together, Sophie found herself seeing Jeremy in a completely different light. When he wasn't being defensive or trying to prove his superiority, he was actually intelligent and thoughtful. He asked good questions, offered creative solutions, and showed genuine interest in helping the presentation succeed. Jeremy, Sophie said as they finished organizing the materials, can I ask you something? Sure, Jeremy replied. Why were you so awful to Dr. Davis at the cafe that day? I mean, what made you think it was okay to treat her like that? Jeremy was quiet for a long moment, clearly uncomfortable with the question. Honestly, Jeremy said finally, I don't know. I was having a bad day. I'd been drinking, and I saw a woman sitting alone and thought, I don't know what I thought. That's not really an answer, Sophie said gently. Jeremy sighed. You're right. The truth is, I've always gotten whatever I wanted without having to work for it or treat people well. I thought my money and my family name meant I could act however I wanted. And now, Sophie asked, now I'm realizing that the way I've been living is pretty pathetic, Jeremy said. Watching you work these past few months, seeing how much people respect you because of how you treat them, it's made me think about what kind of person I want to be. Sophie felt a surprising wave of sympathy for Jeremy. Underneath his arrogance and entitlement, she could see someone who was genuinely trying to figure out how to be better. People can change, Sophie said, if they really want to. Do you think I can change? Jeremy asked, looking at Sophie with what seemed like vulnerability. I think you're already changing, Sophie said honestly. The Jeremy who helped me tonight is very different from the Jeremy I met at the cafe. Jeremy smiled, and for the first time Sophie thought his smile looked genuine and kind. Thank you, Jeremy said, for giving me a chance to prove I can be better. As they gathered their things to leave the office, Sophie realized that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with Jeremy. She still didn't trust him completely, but she was beginning to see him as a real person with flaws and potential, rather than just an entitled obstacle to her success. What Sophie didn't realize was that Jeremy was experiencing an even more dramatic shift in his feelings toward her. Working closely with Sophie, seeing her intelligence and dedication up close, he was developing feelings that went far beyond professional respect. Jeremy was falling in love with the woman he had initially tried to destroy, and he had no idea how to handle emotions he had never experienced before. The next few months would test both Sophie and Jeremy as they navigated their changing relationship while dealing with the complexities of working together in a family business, where personal and professional boundaries were often blurred. 1 year after Sophie started working at Blake Enterprises, she and Jeremy had become not just colleagues, but close friends. What had begun as a professional truce had slowly evolved into genuine affection and respect. Jeremy had proven that his apology was sincere by consistently treating Sophie and everyone else in the company with kindness and professionalism. The moment everything changed between them happened on a snowy December evening when they were working late on a year-end financial report. Sophie had been feeling tired and run down for weeks, but she attributed it to the stress of her demanding job and the evening classes she was taking to finish her degree. Sophie, you should go home, Jeremy said, noticing that she looked pale and exhausted. I can finish this report myself. I'm fine, Sophie insisted, though she was struggling to concentrate on the numbers in front of her. You're not fine, Jeremy said with concern. You've been pushing yourself too hard. When's the last time you took a real break? Sophie tried to remember but realized she couldn't. Between work, school, and helping to support her family, she had been going non-stop for months. Come on, Jeremy said, standing up and putting on his coat. I'm driving you home and you're taking tomorrow off. Jeremy, I can't miss work, Sophie protested. We have the presentation on Monday. The presentation can wait, Jeremy said firmly. Your health is more important than any business meeting. Sophie was touched by Jeremy's concern, but she was also frustrated by his assumption that he could make decisions for her. I appreciate your worry, Sophie said, but I can take care of myself. Jeremy looked at Sophie seriously. Sophie, I care about you. More than I should, probably. I can't watch you work yourself into exhaustion. Something in Jeremy's tone made Sophie look at him more carefully. There was an intensity in his eyes that she had never seen before. What do you mean, more than you should? Sophie asked quietly. Jeremy hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. I mean, I'm in love with you, Jeremy said simply. I have been for months. I know it's complicated because we work together, and I know I don't deserve someone like you after how I treated you initially. But I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just professional respect. Sophie stared at Jeremy in shock. She had noticed that their relationship had become closer and more personal over the past few months, but she had never expected him to have romantic feelings for her. Jeremy, Sophie said softly, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Jeremy replied. I just needed you to know how I feel. Sophie thought about all the ways Jeremy had changed since they first met. The arrogant, entitled young man who had harassed Dr. Davis seemed like a completely different person from the thoughtful, caring man standing in front of her now. I care about you too, Sophie admitted. I didn't expect to, after everything that happened, but you've shown me that people really can change. Jeremy stepped closer to Sophie, hope evident in his expression. Does that mean you'd be willing to see where this could go? Jeremy asked. Sophie felt conflicted. Part of her was attracted to Jeremy and touched by his transformation, but another part of her worried about the complications of dating her boss's son and the power dynamics involved. Jeremy, what if this doesn't work out? Sophie asked. What happens to my job? What happens to our working relationship? I don't know, Jeremy said honestly, but I do know that I'd rather try and fail than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Sophie looked into Jeremy's eyes and saw sincerity and vulnerability that convinced her to take the risk. Okay, Sophie said, let's see what happens. Jeremy smiled and gently took Sophie's hands in his. Can I kiss you? Jeremy asked softly. Sophie nodded, and Jeremy leaned down to kiss her gently. It was tender and sweet, nothing like the aggressive behavior Sophie had witnessed from him at the cafe. Over the next 6 months, Sophie and Jeremy's relationship deepened into genuine love. Jeremy continued to grow as a person, inspired by Sophie's example of hard work and compassion. Sophie discovered that beneath Jeremy's privileged exterior was a man capable of real love and commitment. They kept their relationship private at work, but Harrison Blake eventually figured out what was happening between them. To Sophie's relief, he was supportive of the relationship, telling her that she had been the best influence on his son that he had ever seen. Sophie graduated from college with her business degree, and Harrison Blake promoted her to regional manager, overseeing several of his properties throughout the city. She was successful, respected, and happier than she had ever been in her life. Then, on a routine doctor's visit, for what she thought was just persistent fatigue, Sophie received news that changed everything. Ms. Martinez, Dr. Kim said gently, I'm afraid the test results show that you have stage 3 pancreatic cancer. It's quite advanced. Sophie felt like the world had stopped spinning. What does that mean? It means we need to start treatment immediately, Dr. Kim explained. With aggressive chemotherapy and possibly surgery, we might be able to slow the progression of the disease. Might? Sophie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Kim's expression was compassionate but realistic. Pancreatic cancer is very aggressive, especially at this stage. We'll do everything we can, but I want you to understand that the prognosis is serious. Sophie left the doctor's office in a daze. At 28 years old, just when her life was finally coming together, she was facing a terminal illness. She waited until the evening to tell Jeremy, wanting to process the news herself first. When she finally shared the diagnosis with him, Jeremy's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. No, Jeremy said, pulling Sophie into his arms. There has to be something we can do. The best doctors, experimental treatments, anything. Jeremy, Sophie said through her tears. The doctor was very clear about the prognosis. I don't care what the doctor said, Jeremy replied desperately. I'm not losing you. We'll fight this together. Over the next 8 months, Jeremy kept his promise. He took leave from work to be with Sophie during her chemotherapy treatments. He researched every possible treatment option and flew her to specialists around the country. He held her when the pain was unbearable and made her laugh when she felt like giving up. Harrison Blake was incredibly supportive as well, ensuring that Sophie received the best medical care available and that her family was financially secure regardless of what happened. But despite everyone's efforts and Sophie's brave fight, the cancer continued to progress. By the spring, it was clear that the treatments were no longer working. Sophie, Doctor, Kim said during what they both knew would be one of their final appointments, I think it's time to focus on comfort care rather than aggressive treatment. Sophie nodded, having already come to the same conclusion. She was tired of fighting a battle she couldn't win, and she wanted to spend her remaining time with the people she loved. Jeremy struggled to accept that they were running out of time together, but Sophie helped him understand that their love had been real and meaningful, even if it was going to be shorter than they had hoped. "I need you to promise me something," Sophie told Jeremy as they sat together in the hospital room where she was spending her final days. "Anything," Jeremy said, holding her hand gently. "Promise me you'll keep being the good man you've become," Sophie said. "Don't let losing me turn you back into the person you used to be." "Sophie," Jeremy said, his voice breaking, "I don't know how to do this without you." "You'll figure it out," Sophie said with a weak smile. "You're stronger than you think you are, and you have your father who loves you and a company full of people who need good leadership." "I love you so much," Jeremy whispered. "I love you too," Sophie replied. "Thank you for showing me what it feels like to be truly loved. Thank you for becoming the man I knew you could be." Sophie passed away peacefully on a sunny May morning, surrounded by Jeremy, Harrison Blake, her family, and Dr. Angela Davis, who had become a close friend after their meeting at the cafe. Jeremy was devastated by Sophie's death, but he kept his promise to her. He returned to work and threw himself into making Blake Enterprises a company that reflected Sophie's values of treating everyone with respect and dignity. He established a scholarship fund in Sophie's name for students from working-class families who wanted to pursue business degrees. Harrison Blake watched his son grieve and grow, proud of the man Jeremy had become through his love for Sophie. "She saved us both," Harrison told Jeremy on the first anniversary of Sophie's death. "She saved you from becoming someone you would have hated, and she saved me from having a son I couldn't respect." Jeremy nodded, standing at Sophie's grave with flowers he had brought to honor her memory. "I wish I had more time with her," Jeremy said. "Time isn't what matters," Harrison replied. "Love is what matters. And the love you shared with Sophie changed both of you forever." Jeremy smiled through his tears, knowing his father was right. Sophie Martinez had started as a waitress who stood up for a stranger in a cafe, and she had ended up transforming the lives of everyone who was lucky enough to know her. Her legacy lived on in the man Jeremy had become, in the company policies that prioritized treating employees fairly, and in the scholarship that would help other young people achieve their dreams, just as Sophie had achieved hers. Sometimes love stories don't end with happily ever after. Sometimes they end with grateful hearts, and the knowledge that even a short time with the right person can change everything for the better.